Before we get on with tonight's program, I want to point out that the soil ecology walk that we had scheduled for tomorrow. Now the bird watchers went out Tuesday and had a great time, but the soil people apparently not as fun. As the announcement said, we've delayed that till Saturday, April 5. So if you were planning on going on that, and Peter, you're still leading it on April 5, aren't you?
That's right.
Okay, so it's on Okay, tonight, Dan Fagin grew up in Oklahoma. I'm pleased to say, with no particular bias, that he's also a graduate of Dartmouth College. That makes him a very special person and very well trained in all aspects of environment. A member of the journalism department at New York University, having spent a long time at Newsday, and some 15 years at Newsday writing on environmental issues and leaving great acclaim, particularly in studies and reports of cancer epidemiology. He's been president of the Society of Environmental Journalists, which all of us that deal with trying to get environment into the press know about and respect and love to interact with. And he runs that organization. And has become the author of a number of books, the most recent, Tom's River, which in our usual fashion will be available outside afterwards with a signing, courtesy of our cooperation with Merritt Bookstore. Has been awarded the Green Book of the Year. And let's see, New York Times had a particularly nice phrase for it. A classic of science reporting in the New York Times book review of Tom's River when it came out. So Dan is here to tell us about the book and tell us about his view of cancer epidemiology in the Tom's River and how it came to pass and how it came to be cleaned up. And welcome to Carey Institute.
He told me it was going to be beautiful up there. Even in the mist. Can everybody hear me all right? Am I scared? So, first of all, let me just thank you for being here and for caring about these kinds of issues. I love people who love books, and I love people who actually are interested in what it means to be a citizen, And that's one of the things I want to talk about. I think one of the interesting things that happened in Tom's River is that people awoke to the burdens and the challenges and the opportunities and the blessings of what it really means to be a citizen. And we face such difficult challenges. I think maybe one of the most important things that I hope this book will be a part of is the idea of encouraging people to show up, to listen, to learn, to take part, and to act. And so thank you for being among those people. So we called this talk Connecting the Dots, which is a bit of a play on words because, as you'll see, epidemiology is the study of patterns, and one of the things you try to do when you're an epidemiologist is to try to make sense of the dots over space and time. But connecting the dots is also about going from the macro to the micro, recognizing that, if you've seen a Seurat painting, you know that little dots, when you're looked at up close, when you pull back, there's a much more meaningful image that appears. And one of the things that good journalism does, one of the things that good citizens do are to connect those dots. That's what I hope to do. So I want to begin with a quote from a friend of mine, and a kind of a legendary figure in public health, David Ozanoff, who is professor emeritus at Boston University. He says the definition of a catastrophe is a health effect so large that even an epidemiological study can detect it. He's a funny guy, but he's also deadly serious. And I've spoken to him, many times over the years, and there's a kind of a sadness that you get from him and from other people who care a lot about environmental health. They feel like our tools are not good enough, that we're investing in all the wrong areas. We need to do more. We need to be smarter. So the whole impetus of the Toms River book, there it is. There are more outside. No pressure, no pressure. The whole impetus of the Toms River book was to try to figure out, why don't we know more? And what should we be doing instead? And what can we learn from what happened in Toms River? And how can we make sure, or at least reduce the likelihood that there are new Toms Rivers? And finally, how can we figure out how many more Toms Rivers there are, but we can't really see them? Those are hard questions, and they all go back to both politics and science. Science in the sense of, how do we know what we know? And politics in the sense of, how can we better allocate resources to try to answer these questions that are so difficult to answer? Why is it so difficult to identify a catastrophe that's unfolding before our eyes? So let me begin by just telling you a few things about Toms River. Everyone always is either from New Jersey or has relatives in New Jersey or friends in New Jersey. So many of you probably know that Toms River is here on the Jersey shore. It's equidistant from New York and Philly. There's sort of a famous line about Toms River that Toms River is the place where the radio signals fade out. You can't get good reception from either the New York or Philadelphia stations. And I guess that's kind of a metaphor maybe for the fact that Toms River was, and to some extent still is, a pretty insular place. And that also played a role in this story. Toms River was a quiet place for centuries, really. What changed, what began the process of change was when the chemical industry came to town in 1952 in the form of a company that's gone through various names. It now doesn't exist as SIVA anymore. It's now been bought by BASF, the largest chemical company in the world. It's been split up, sliced and diced a million ways. But back then, it was SIVA, and they were a Swiss company that were involved in the very beginnings of the chemical industry in Basel, Switzerland. They made a real hash of things in Basel, and I tell this story in the book. So they began to look for other places to do business. They were in Poland for a while, they were in England, other places in Switzerland. The dye business is a very messy business. It generates much more waste than it does actual product, as amazing as that sounds. So everywhere they went, they were not very good neighbors. In the early part of the 20th century, they went to Cincinnati and started polluting the Ohio River really badly. And there was also a cluster of bladder cancers among employees. So much that such a large cluster that among the employees who worked in one particular building in Cincinnati, more than 75% of the employees who handled a particular chemical ultimately developed bladder cancers, which is pretty astonishing. So anybody who tells you that, well, we don't really know whether there's such a thing as environmentally induced cancer, just check the book out. Tell them to check out my book in the library. They'll even have to plug me on $20. And I can give you 100 examples to the contrary, and that's one of the most extreme. So they came to Tom's River in 1952, and they came to Tom's River for a particular reason. Here's a map of the boat. This is big, giant open space. So we'll go kind of ahead here, and you can see what it looks like. This was the plant at its height in the 70s. Big, giant, sprawling place. That was one of the largest dye manufacturing factories in the world, and they also made plastics, a lot of other industrial products. They came because they wanted space and they wanted privacy. They also wanted sandy soil, and they wanted a river nearby. They needed all those things because they created so much pollution. They needed the sandy soil because they needed a place to dump their liquid waste where it would just go away, right? So you know what happens if you're on the beach and you pour water on the beach? The water's gone, right? We never have to worry about it. Well, by the late 1950s, within a few years of opening up their shop in Tom's River, the employees and even the officers of the company were noticing that their own drinking water tasted funny. They had fouled their own wells. Their solution to that was, this is the direction of drainage, so they just moved their water supply up here, right? And they just let all the waste, all these sites here are waste, places where waste was piled. They just let all that waste run into the river, right? That became a problem because down here was the most important source of water for the whole town, the Holly Street wells, and it's right on the river here. We call this a river, but right here, in that part, it's more like a puny little stream. And at one point, during the early 60s, the volume of waste that the SIBA plant was putting into the water was actually almost as high as the natural water volume. So in other words, natural volume of water. So in other words, almost half of that river was wastewater, was hazardous wastewater. And people were swimming in it, and this well field was pumping here, and it pumped water out of the river and distributed it around town. And people realized, some of the first people who realized that the public water was tasting funny were the people who worked at the plant, because they remembered when their own water a few years earlier wasn't tasting right. So people realized that there was a problem, but they kept it secret. People in Tom's River, by this time the town was growing very fast. So fast that during parts of the 60s and 70s, Ocean County was the fastest growing county in the United States. Or I guess one of the 5 fastest growing counties in the United States. So people's property values were going up. There were many good jobs at the plant. These were good blue-collar jobs that paid well. You could buy a house, and your house was appreciating. Nobody really wanted to rock the boat. So when the water started tasting funny, the company got together with the water company, and they cut a secret deal. And they said, okay, we're going to filter these wells, and we're going to drill some new wells. Eventually they chose this spot up here, the Parkway well field, which turned out to be a very faithful choice. And they did something else too. They said, you know what, we'll build a big waste pipe. Run it right through town, cross the barrier beach, cross Barnaby Bay, and into the Atlantic Ocean, and we're going to dump all of that liquid waste, billions and billions of gallons a year of liquid waste, into the ocean. Because the ocean is a big place. Everybody knows the solution to pollution is dilution, so let's just get rid of it, right? The people on the beach were upset about that, but very few people full-time lived on the beach. So the pipe was built, so things quieted down again. They quieted down. Then something else happened. In Newark and North New Jersey, lots of people were, the chemical industry for a while, New Jersey was the most important state in the country for chemical production. later it was Texas and Louisiana, but there was a point in the 50s and 60s where New Jersey was the most important. And as a result, it became very difficult to get rid of chemical waste in North Jersey, where most of these plants were. So truckers started running barrels of the big truckloads of hazardous waste down to South Jersey because, hey, nobody lives in South Jersey, right? We can just take their stuff down there and not worry about it. So they did. They would drive down Route 9 and look for places to dump. And it turned out there was a farmer here. Chicken farming used to be very big, but starting in the 1960s, there were refrigerated trucks, and the whole chicken industry was sort of falling apart. And you could bring you could truck in your chickens from hundreds of miles away, so there was no advantage getting close to New York or Philadelphia. So people had a lot of land that they couldn't afford, and the way that a lot of people decided to make money was to turn their property into dumps. Both legal, semi-legal, or downright illegal. So a guy named Ralph Fernicola took ultimately 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, as many as 6,000 drums of hazardous waste from the Bound Brook plant of Union Carbides, and he cut a deal with the owner of this property. He said, listen, I'm just going to store these barrels on the back of your farm. Don't worry about it, I'll just store them. But it was such a sweet gig for this trucker. He was making so much money. He made so much money, he used to stop at the track with the barrels of waste in his truck. He would stop and gamble because he had so much money to burn. The Union Carbide was paying him well. So eventually, he just started dumping the barrels in the ground. For a while, he took them over to the landfill, but he had to bribe the guys at the landfill to get the hazardous waste there. And after a while, the guys at the landfill said, well, we're going to have to bribe us. You're going to have to pay us more, a larger illegal bribe. So he went to Wright Farm, started dumping. After a while, he got so desperate, he wouldn't even, he would just open the back of the truck and just throw the barrels on the ground and let them smash and pour. So he did this for about a year in the early 70s until the town and Union Carbide finally, and Mr. Wright finally started paying attention. Actually, at Wright Farm, he did it for about 5 or 6 months, and a number of months over at the town landfill. By the time the town woke up to the problem, it was a full-blown Superfund site. I mean, that was before when we used that term, but it was a really bad hazardous waste site. So Toms River had 2 big waste problems. Here's the plan. This just gives you a sense of scale. This is one of the landfills from the factory as it was being cleaned out in the 90s. Very good place. They had to number all the barrels that they pulled out. All these barrels were dumped illegally. It was hazardous waste that they were not supposed to put in this landfill. So ultimately, SEMA had to remove them all, and there were 16,000 barrels. Here's what happened with Wright Farm. Because the town was growing so fast, because the other well field was very problematic, they decided, it had already been contaminated by the river pollution. The town decided, well, let's build a bunch of wells here. The town was growing like crazy, insanely. There was very little effort to control growth. The schools were understaffed. The roads were not in good shape, but it was a money machine, in turn for real estate. And nobody wanted it to stop. So they drilled and drilled, and eventually the pumpage from the Parkway wellfield got so extreme that it just sucked down the pollution from Wright Farm. Sucked it down like a straw. A whole bunch of straws, really. And again, that pollution was distributed all over town. So, starting in the 1990s, early 1990s, people began to wake up to what was happening. Actually, we have to say 1980s for when people began to wake up. There was a big fight in Toms River over the ocean pipe and whether the pipeline to the ocean should be allowed to got involved. They snuck onto the factory property and climbed the water tower, and all kinds of crazy things happened that I described in the book. And eventually, the plant wound down its operations, and just as they had moved from Basel to Cincinnati, Toms River, the plant, SIBA moved its chemical manufacturing operations, split them up to Alabama, Louisiana, and eventually, inevitably, China, as I'll discuss later. So, the people, Toms River no longer had the benefit of the employment that came with the chemical industry. But they did have this terrible legacy of waste. And there were also some families that were thinking, something doesn't look right here. This woman is Linda Gillick. This baby she's holding is not her own, it's someone else's baby. But Linda Gillick became the leader of the families in Toms River. There were many others who were also involved, but she was very important. Her son, Michael, was diagnosed with neuroblastoma when he was just a few months old. Back then, neuroblastoma was a horrible, horrible diagnosis to have. It's still not great now, but it's much better than it used to be. And it was such a terribly upsetting time for the Gillicks that they actually bought a coffin for Michael because the doctors said it was 50-50 at best that he would reach his first birthday. And when the time came, the Gillicks didn't want to have to actually purchase a coffin. They thought that would be too traumatic. So they bought a coffin. They celebrated his first birthday at 6 months because they didn't know whether he would have it first. Amazingly, Michael is still alive today. He's 30-something years old and became a citizen activist in Toms River, just like his mom. So Linda Gillick would go to hospitals all over Toms River at the time did not have an advanced pediatric cancer ward, so she would go to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia sometimes. Sometimes she would go to New York and go to New York Hospital or Sloan Kettering, depending on what kind of treatment Michael needed or who he was consulting. And she was a very outgoing person. And everywhere she would go, she would ask, hey, where are you from? She would talk to the other parents in the meeting room. And she felt like everywhere she went, there was someone from Toms River. And she started keeping track. She got active in a cancer group. And she started making a little map on her living room that she kept in her living room with little pins of people she knew from Toms River who had kids, from Toms River area who had kids with cancer. Now, this business of making maps is the essence of epidemiology, right? And you're probably wondering, who's that guy? The thing about maps is that they can be powerful, but they can also be misleading. And one of the easiest ways to understand how they can be misleading is to think about this guy who's the Texas sharpshooter. It's a sort of an old story. Just imagine a cowboy. He's a little bit drunk, and he's just shooting wildly at the side of a barn, just smashing, not even aiming. And the bullets are flying all over the place. But then suddenly he sees a beautiful young woman walking down the trail that he wants to impress. So he rushes over and he looks at where the dots have, wherever his shots have clustered, and he draws a target right there. He says, yeah, I was aiming there all the time. All right? So that's called Texas sharpshooting. And if you think about epidemiology, it's the same idea. Linda Gillick thought that there was a real pattern here. But was there a real pattern? We all know that in nature, things do not distribute themselves evenly, right? You look up in the sky, you don't see birds evenly distributed across the sky. They clump. Things clump for reasons that could be completely random. On the other hand, sometimes clumping means something. The art of epidemiology is trying to understand when does a clump random and when does it actually mean something? When does a cluster really mean something? Even to this day, people are very skeptical about so-called cancer clusters, right? Linda Gillick was sure that there was a cancer cluster in Toms River. And ultimately, based on my own work, I think she was right. And I think that the science shows that she was right. But even now, not everyone is going to agree. This was a story written by a friend of mine, George Johnson, and he and I had friendly, but violent, not physically violent, but emotionally violent disagreements about how much we can believe spatial epidemiology. And this is by a guy named Atul Gawande, who's a beautiful health writer for The New Yorker, who's highly skeptical of cancer clusters. So people are skeptical. They were not skeptical. They were experiencing a terrible personal tragedy, and they thought there might be a cause. They did not understand why this terrible thing had befallen their family and why it seemed like there were a lot of local families who were going through this. And it wasn't just Linda and her son Michael. This is the Andersons, Bruce and Melanie, another local couple whose son was diagnosed when he was a teenager. Ultimately, there were dozens. Depending on how you measure the cluster, there were anywhere from 60 to 120 or more kids from the Toms River area who were diagnosed with cancer over a period of 25 years or so. That was way more than expected, as would ultimately come out. They asked for a long time for the State Health Department to take a look and see. We think there's something going on in Toms River. Will you take a look? The State Health Department said no. They said, we don't see any reason to investigate what's happening here. This woman was the reason that something finally happened. Her name is Lisa Bornese, and she is a nurse. She was a nurse at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She worked in pediatric oncology ward, and just like Linda, she noticed that there were a lot of kids coming to her ward from Toms River. It became a source of dark humor in the hospital. People realized, she and the nurses would say, oh, here's another one from Toms River. And you know, when you're a nurse, you really need to know your patients. You work the overnight shift. You agonize with the families. You get yelled at by the parents sometimes who are frustrated, and you have to give the kids, some kind of change their dressings or change their meal stick, for whatever reason. It's a very traumatic thing. And so, the doctors don't have that kind of direct connection, but the nurses do. And so when a kid from Toms River would come in, and when a kid from Toms River would die, or really a kid from anywhere, Lisa would go to the funeral. And so she went to a few funerals in Toms River, and every time she went to a funeral, she would drive past that plant behind the trees. And she would say, oh yeah, that's the plant that the parents were telling me about. And it happened that Lisa had a sister-in-law who worked for the Environmental Protection Agency. And she talked to her sister-in-law a lot about this. And she kind of bugged her and said, we got to do something about this. She also talked to the doctors, CHOP, the people on the pediatric oncology ward. The doctor said, it's just a coincidence. Feels like a lot of kids from Toms River, but don't worry about it. Just do your job. Keep your head down. Lisa decided she didn't want to do that. She thought that this needed to be looked into. She convinced her sister-in-law. Her sister-in-law, in turn, contacted an agency called the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, an agency so obscure that most people have never heard of it. But they work with the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, to investigate environmental illness. The ATSDR in turn called the health department, and the health department decided, okay, we'll look into it. This, by the way, is Linda's group that she founded. It's an amazing group. They're still around, helping families with cancer. So if you feel so motivated, and you'll also see their names in my book, they're a wonderful charity. So a guy named Michael Berry, a very good-hearted guy, decided that he would do statistical analysis and see were the number of cases in Toms River really unusual, or was it just like, well, it seemed like there were a lot of cases, but you know what? It's really to be expected. So So he did that analysis. He compared it to the state of New Jersey as a whole. And sure enough, he found that for virtually every category of childhood cancer that he looked at, Tom's River was significantly above expected. He had never seen that before. He was used to seeing clusters, he was used to seeing exceedances that would sort of pop up for one particular cancer or a year or two, but this was a consistent pattern across all cancers. He was worried about that. He talked to his boss. His boss talked to his boss, all the way up to the state health commissioner, and they decided, you know what, go ahead, write the report, but we're not going to do anything more with this, and we're not going to release this report publicly, because it will just upset people. So he wrote a letter, and he said, yep, all SIRs, incidence ratios, calculated for Dover Township, that's the official name of Tom's River at that time, were higher than expected. Rain and CNS were more than 2.5 times higher than expected, right? But not statistically significant. It's another problem, because the number of cases was so small. But the numbers were very high, much higher than expected. But still, overall, there was enough uncertainty in the figures that you couldn't be sure. So he wrote that letter, and he thought that that would be the end of it. But that was not the end of it, because people in Tom's River found out through kind of a weird series of coincidences that could easily not have happened. Linda Gillick found out. Linda Gillick had a friend on her board of Ocean of Love who knew somebody at the Star-Ledger, the top editor at the New York Star-Ledger, which is the largest newspaper in New Jersey, the most powerful newspaper in New Jersey. The editor at the Star-Ledger happened to be interested and said, okay, we'll look into it. He happened to give it to another reporter who was very aggressive. Through the sort of a weird sequence of events, word got out, and there was a screaming headline, and all hell broke loose in Tom's River. There were screaming hordes of people in front of the health department. More than 1,000 people packed the high school auditorium. State police were there, and it was a good thing that they were there because people were really, really upset. Extremely upset. It's something they did not understand, something that had been kept secret from them, was happening in their community. The result of all that was that a piece of case control epidemiology was finally done. The state had initially refused to do this multiple times, but the pressure from more than 1,000 people screaming, virtually holding the state health commissioner hostage in this auditorium, was finally enough to get this study going. There was federal money kicked in, state money. It took 5 or 6 years, but eventually the study was done. Came out in 2001, and to everyone's shock, they found through a very sort of complex series of calculations that there was a very strong association between exposure to parkway water or air, that water from the parkway wells, or air from the Ciba-Geigen factory. There's a strong association between those exposures and higher incidence of leukemia, especially in girls. This almost never happens. It's extremely unusual for an epidemiological study to find a pattern so powerful that it can actually pass a test of statistical significance. And that's what David Ozonoff was getting at in his very broad definition of catastrophe. This was such a big catastrophe that an epi study could actually find it. The parents, meanwhile, 69 of them, ultimately 69 families, meanwhile were also pursuing a legal negotiation. They didn't actually go to court, but they did a kind of a fascinating out-of-court negotiation process that took many years. If you've read the book or seen the movie A Civil Action, remember the lawyer who John Travolta played, named Jan Schlickman, Jan Schlickman was involved in this, as were some lawyers from Philadelphia, Kuker, Berzowski, and others. And eventually, the families reached a settlement. The settlement was announced just a few days before the results of the case control, which makes sense, because both sides, both the chemical companies, the water company on one side, the families on the other, they were really worried. How was this big case control study going to turn out? Was it going to find that the families were right, that there's good reason to believe that pollution caused, at least was a factor in some of these illnesses? Or would the study find that, sorry, there's no relationship? So it was a gamble, and ultimately they decided to settle the case, settle their negotiation, just before the results of the study were released. The families got various amounts of money. Some got a little less than 100, ranging from a little less than 100,000 to a little more than 600,000 per family. We can talk about whether was that a fair amount of money, considering what these families had gone through. Many of them had actually lost their child. Their child was dead. I don't think it was enough. On the other hand, epidemiology is not about certainty. It's only about probability. And who knows what a jury would have said or done. So this was the solution. I'm going to skip this part because we don't have a lot of time. But you can see that what happens with epidemiology is you're trying to figure out what looks like a cluster, what looks like an exceedance, is it really an exceedance? And this is typical. This odds ratio says the kids who were exposed to Parkway water for these 4 years, what was the likelihood that they, of those who drank Parkway water, what was the how much more likely were those families to have kids with leukemia? You can see in this case they were 3 times more likely. And the 95% confidence interval, which is like a margin of error in an opinion poll, was pretty wide. On the other hand, it almost certainly was over 1. So it almost certainly was over 1. So therefore, it's a pretty powerful finding. Anyway, there were a whole series of these findings. And this is how they wrote it up. So, in the end, what is there? How do we know what really happened in Tom's River? And the answer is we don't really know. We don't, and we will never know for sure, right? Studying patterns of disease will never tell us about causation. But there are some things that we can look at. And one of the things that you can look at is, well, what happened after the factory was closed, after the Parkway wells were finally filtered, as they should have been 20 years earlier? What happened? This line represents leukemia incidence per 100,000 children in Tom's River. This line represents for the state of New Jersey. You can see that it was consistently high until the Parkway wells were filtered around this time period, and then it fell. Now again, is that proof? No, it is not proof. That's just a correlation. But it's a pretty powerful correlation. It's a pretty powerful correlation. So what does this mean for us, right? How are we doing in terms of improving environmental health? Well, kids are a pretty good group to look at when it comes to environmental health. Especially if you look at cancer, right? Cancer is a disease of genes, right? It's still so many uncertainties about cancer. But we know that cancer becomes much more likely if there are a series of mutations. And that's why cancer is mostly a disease of the elderly. You can see the vast majority of cancer cases. And by the way, I'm calling cancer a disease, but of course it isn't. It's actually 150 plus diseases that just have rapid cell division, genetic gene-based rapid cell division in common. But anyway, you can see that a huge number of cases are elderly. So when kids get cancer, we notice it. It's not just because we love our kids, but it's because cancer is much more unusual in kids. So we see a kid with cancer, and we know that cancer is a disease of accumulated mutations. Then we ask ourselves, where did those mutations come from? Now, in an older person, your body's gone through so many generations of cell division, right? Millions of generations of cell division, that mutations accumulate through copying errors. But in kids, the mathematics tells us that that's much less common. It's much more likely that if kids have mutations, they either inherited those or there were environmental mutations having to do with some way that the mother was exposed while the kid was in utero, or the kid was him or herself exposed when the kid was young. So how are we actually doing that if kids are canaries in the coal mine? Kids are a really important way to see how we're doing with environmental health. How are we doing? Well, in one way, we're doing really well. We're doing a great job at keeping kids alive, curing them more or less, at least getting them into remission. You can see the green bars are from 1962. Red bars are present. This slide's a few years old, but you can see it's really wonderful. Like, look what's happening with neuroblastoma. This is 5-year survival rate. It's actually much higher than 55% now because there's a couple of really great new drugs. We're doing great on the medical front, and that's partly because of amazing scientific research. It's also because there are powerful economic incentives to develop cancer drugs and to build diagnostic machines that are really good at figuring out who gets sick and why. They're really good at detecting cancer early. So that's great. How are we doing in terms of actually preventing childhood cancer to begin with? Pretty lousy, actually, as it happens. What's the economic incentive to prevent cancer? I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, at a societal level, sure, there's huge incentive to avoid medical costs, right? But we can see with healthcare reform that that is a really hard argument to make, or at least it's a hard argument for people to accept, right? People have a much easier time grasping the idea of this child is sick, let's fix her, than they have let's keep this child healthy to begin with. So we're not doing particularly well. In some cases, again, this slide is old, but the picture hasn't changed much. In some cases, there's a slight decrease. In most cases, incidence is actually rising. Some of that is maybe due to better diagnosis. On the other hand, our diagnostics for kids with cancer were always pretty good, unlike some other diseases. So we're not doing that well. Just as disturbingly, the practices that created this terrible situation in Tom's River have moved elsewhere. I end my book by going to Chongqing. Chongqing, by Chinese standards, is just another city. It's pretty small. It's only got 30 million people in it. By Chinese standards, that puts Chongqing, I think, in the top 10, maybe. By our standards, it would be the largest city in the United States. Chongqing is a sprawling metropolis. It is growing crazy fast. This is the Chongqing Children's Hospital. If you go up to the pediatric ward, the oncology ward of the Chongqing Children's Hospital, you will see patients out in the hallway. You will see patients in the lobby, in their gurneys. It's sprawling. They are packed to the gills. And if you ask those parents, how did your kid get sick? What happened? They will immediately talk about environmental exposures. Do we know that that's why they got sick? No, we don't know that. We do not know that. We will never know that. Epidemiology can never tell us about causes. We can never go back and say, okay, I can tell what it is that gave you leukemia or neuroblastoma. There are only a few diseases we can do that with, right? And if you watch late night television, you'll see the ads from lawyers for asbestosis, for example, for mesothelioma. And it turns out that only exposure to asbestos, with very rare exceptions, can give you mesothelioma. So there's a booming legal business because causation is clear. But for most diseases, the cause is not at all clear. There are multiple causes. So this is what's happening in China today, and it's very disturbing. On the other hand, there are some positive things that are also happening. People of China are waking up to what's happening, just as the people of Tom's River woke up to what was happening in their community. The difference on the downside is that China is a totalitarian society where information is tightly controlled, or at least there's an attempt to tightly control information. On the positive side, there's the internet. And the internet is turning out to be impossible to control, although the Chinese are doing their best. There's a whole movement in China now called the Cancer Villages movement, where lots of people at the grassroots are mapping what's happening in their communities. It's called Cancer Villages not because cancer is only confined to the rural areas. Of course not. There's environmental disease everywhere. But the Chinese cities are so vast and so teeming that there's no sense of community at all. So no one even really has an idea of how to begin to understand what's happening to the families around them. So the Cancer Villages movement is really rooted more in the rural areas because at least people have a sense of their community. So how are we going to stop what happened in Basel, and then what happened in Tom's River, and what's happening now in China? How are we going to break that cycle? How are we going to make sure that what the kids of Tom's River went through and their families, how do we get that to stop? The hard answer is, the harsh answer is, it's going to be incredibly difficult to make that happen. But I also think there are some very tangible things that we can do. And just in the last 5 minutes here, I just want to run through a few of them really quickly. The first thing that I think we can do is that we can think harder about what data can do for us. We collect a massive amount of environmental data in this country. Scientists here at the Institute have access to these databases. But they're very disparate, they're very diffuse, they're collected by all sorts of different levels of government. It's very chaotic. There's no systematic effort to comb through environmental data and to comb through health data, cancer registries and other kinds of disease registries, and look for patterns and see where those patterns match. We could be doing this. Other parts of the world are much better at doing this than we are. Northern Europe is especially good. The Scandinavian countries, the best epidemiology in the world comes out of the Scandinavian countries because they have a real commitment to funding public health and because they pay attention to their data. So why do we do that in the United States? Well, we hear a few different excuses. It's too expensive. It's uncertain. It will tar people because we won't be able to prove it, but it will just scare people and we won't be able to know for sure, and it'll just make corporations look bad. It's an invasion of privacy. It will disclose confidential business information. It's just a waste of time. It'll just make people upset. Sort of the same reason that the New Jersey Department of Health thought it was a good idea not to release that information to the people of Tom's River back in 95 to their regular practice. Well, I actually know a different part of the U.S. government that collects a massive amount of data and doesn't really care about personal privacy or certainty or confidential business information, or making people look bad, or proof of innocence or guilt. The National Security Agency is damn good at pattern recognition, right? U.S. intelligence agencies have an on-the-books budget of $80 billion, right? $80 billion. And they have developed massive databases kept in epically huge data centers like the one they're building in Utah that are really good at collecting information and looking for patterns and allegedly doing that for our protection. And I'm not here to argue that that's a waste of money. I don't know enough to argue that. I know there are people in this world that are out to get us. We need people looking after those terrorists on our behalf. I totally agree, and I think it's especially relevant for people overseas who have been much more affected by terrorism than we have. All I'm saying is the EPA's budget is $8 billion, not $80 billion. And as a percentage of GNP in the United States, it's the smallest it's ever been. It's smaller than it was in the early 1970s when the EPA was created. I just want to give you a quick stat on that. So, last year, there were 1.6 billion cancer cases and about 600,000 deaths, right? Now, we all know that cancer is not the only issue with environmental health. There are lots of other things going on. But let's just only look at cancer. 600,000 deaths in the United States. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that only 10% of those were environmentally mediated, right? I think the percentage is higher. All cancer has polyglot of causes, some inherited, some environmental, some how we define environmental is very broad. Let's just say 10% of those pollution plays, some environmental contamination, environmental pollution plays some kind of role. That's 60,000 deaths a year in the United States alone. Why are we doing something about it? We also have a really messed up view of environmental regulation in this country. We think of environmental law not as a matter of criminality. This is the law, and you will follow the law, or you will pay the price for it. We tend to think of environmental law more as a matter of negotiation, right? Environmental regulation in this country is not about punishing people. It's about negotiating compliance, right? So everything is subject to negotiation. When everything becomes subject to negotiation, then polluters get to decide, okay, in this case, you know what? It's really worth my while to go ahead and continue to violate the law, because I can negotiate the finances of this work out as such that it's better for me to just push off the enforcement until later, or pay a small fine. The other thing about environmental enforcement in our country is that we drastically underfund it. We are in a kind of a vicious cycle in this country where we don't put much money behind enforcement. Our regulatory agencies are drastically understaffed, including even here in New York. And as a result, we don't get very good compliance. We don't get very good enforcement. We don't get very good service from our regulatory agencies. And so people lose faith in the government. And therefore, there's no constituency to push for stronger government regulation because people think that government regulation doesn't work. So it's a kind of a vicious cycle that we're stuck in. That's bleeding the regulatory system dry. It's a very hollow regulatory system. Much more hollow in some ways than it was 25 years ago, as hard as that is to believe. The laws themselves, many of them are drastically out of date, but the biggest problem we have is that we don't enforce the actual laws that we have. And I got to say that environmentalists, to some extent, are part of the problem. Environmentalists at the grassroots are very much focused on things that are going on in their community, which is wonderful. The national environmental groups are very much focused on getting new laws, lobbying for new laws, and they've been dramatically unsuccessful at that, which is why we're stuck with an environmental legal system that the most important laws were all passed in the 70s and early 80s. So we're stuck. We're stuck. How are we going to get unstuck? I don't have an obvious answer to that. But I do think that it's possible to think back to what happened in Tom's River and maybe draw a couple of lessons. The first of which is we can't just reflexively lash out and say, I don't want it. I want to keep living the way that I've always lived. I hate the idea of all nuclear power, for example, and so that's against, I think of environmentalism as some kind of an inviolable doctrine, and we can't consider any kind of new ideas. One of the reasons that we're stuck in this cycle of not getting anywhere is because too many people who identify themselves as environmentalists, as I do, are not open to the idea of recognizing the fact that environmentalism is not a religion. It's not a set of doctrines. Environmentalism is just a way of thinking about the world that looks at the world thinking about what is the evidence, where are we going, right? How can we reconcile the needs of people who are very poor and don't necessarily share our lifestyle? They can see what they want. They can look on the television and see what they're missing out. People in China, whatever. It's really, really important for us to do what the people of Tom's River did. And that is, instead of just showing up and screaming in an auditorium and saying, what's happening in our community? That is what happened initially. But what happened next is that the people of Tom's River educated themselves. They wanted to understand what really happens in a health study. They wanted to understand how epidemiology works. They got many people in their town to fully participate, right? Many people thought that a case control study on the scope of Tom's River would be impossible. But the people of Tom's River got involved. They became active citizens. They didn't just react emotionally, they reacted intellectually. They got involved. I think that the only way that we're going to break out of this cycle of where environmentalism is really stuck. It's not necessarily stuck at the grassroots, but it's stuck at the national and international level. The only way that we're going to deal with this epic challenge of global warming and global climate change is we're going to have to stop thinking of environmentalism as a unique set of doctrines, as something separate, as something that's unconnected from other issues, issues of poverty, issues of personal freedom. We're going to have to start making broader connections. We're going to have to understand that maybe we're going to have to think about the world in a different way, because this is now our world, right? There's no, Bill McKibben wrote a famous book called The End of Nature, maybe some of you will have read. And the point that Bill McKibben was making is that there is no part of this earth anymore that operates entirely under natural cycles, right? We are in charge of this planet. And that means that we're going to have to think about our relations with the natural world in very different ways. If we're going to avoid more Tom's Rivers, we're not only going to have to get involved and show up at meetings, but we're going to have to immerse ourselves in a very messy science, the messy business of understanding, making choices, and figuring out how do we balance different values, how do we make difficult decisions. We're going to have to recognize that sometimes, I mean, this is already happening with fracking, right? We're going to have to figure out a way to find a middle way between our sort of instinctive dislike of things that strike us as not appropriate environmentally, but we're also going to have to reconcile that with these broader challenges that we face that might force us to think a different way. We can talk about fracking if there's time, but my own feeling is that, and this is sacrilege, I guess, especially up here, but if we had some kind of a rational plan to decarbonize our energy system, it would make sense to use natural gas as a bridge fuel. And it would even make sense to do fracking in a carefully regulated, smart way. The problem is that we have no such strategy, right? We give every indication that we're just going to run through natural gas the way that we ran through coal and ran through oil. And in 20 years, when the International Energy Agency tells us that we're going to be out of natural gas, even fracked gas, we're going to be right where we are now, right? We're going to have been made no progress in making the really tough decisions to decarbonize our energy system. So I guess what I'm saying is try to resist the easy solutions. And when you get involved and you become citizens like the people of Tom's River did, then things can happen. Good things can happen. And that's what happened in Tom's River. So thank you very much.
the citizen pushing back against it in this state are sort of a Tom's River type of situation. And I evolved from believing the bullshit about being a bridge fuel because it's another greenhouse gas. So why would we spend billions of dollars to build pipelines for a gas that we shouldn't be using at all?
Yeah.
And I think that the citizen action in this state is an excellent example of what can be done and what has been done by people who educated themselves about the science, the health effects, as opposed to Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Texas, where the citizens are being harmed, but they don't seem to know what to do about it. So I think we're in Tom's River before the wells have got contaminated, where there is the industrial plant, but that plume has not gotten to us yet.
Yeah. I mean, I can't argue with anything that you said. I mean, like I said, if I was confident that we had a strong regulatory regime with a fully staffed DC and Department of Health, which we don't have, and if we had state-of-the-art regs, then I'm not sure that I would oppose all gas fracking. If, and only if, it was part of a larger, heavy research and development push to decarbonize the energy system. Because theoretically, even with what we know about methane leaking, theoretically, natural gas is superior to coal. We know this. We don't have any of those things. I don't have any optimism at all that we will get a rigorous regulatory regime for fracking, even in New York State. So for that reason, I take your point, and I do not miss the fracking in New York State.
Oh, are you aware that the Chesapeake Energy has research, and I think they're starting to use food chemicals to do their fracking? And I don't see how, if we can eat it, and they're going to put a frack, how does it really contaminate it?
Yeah, I have heard that. I wouldn't want to pronounce on that one way or the other. I mean, I just don't know enough about it to say for sure. What I do know is that the regulatory system and the regulatory regime that's in place, certainly in other states and even in New York State, is woefully inadequate. I know that. And until it is in place and until it's accompanied by some kind of a rational plan to move toward a decarbonized energy system, I can't understand.
One more here.
SIBA and other chemical companies, they are producing products that seem to be necessary in a lot of space. So would it have been possible, what would it have taken, would it have even been feasible for SIBA to behave in a responsible way? Would that have been possible? Is it possible with other chemical processes? I mean, what do you do with all this stuff? Can you handle it in some way without inevitably, corrupting all the natural areas?
Yeah, that's the really big question, isn't it? And I do think that there are some hopeful things that are happening. There's a new field called green chemistry that is very important. And green chemistry begins with the idea that every molecule, every kind of molecule has to be, the entire life cycle of the molecule has to be taken into account when you're trying to figure out what something can do. And it turns out that when you look at products that way, you wind up coming up with entirely different kinds of manufacturing processes, many of which wind up producing a lot less waste. The difficulty is that actually transitioning to that, we have this huge infrastructure, right? We have the infrastructure in the States, now the infrastructure is in China and India and Indonesia and other places like that. So once the infrastructure is in place, it's really tough to make that transition. And I don't see any indication that that's really happening.
So I have an answer to that. Conservation.
Yeah.
I don't need New York City lit up like it is tonight.
Yeah.
I was a whistleblower from Metro North for 32 years. I got at least 50 chains. This is one little guy here that did that. All I had to do was make the call.
It's interesting that energy intensity in the United States is actually superior. It's down from what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. That is all due to efficiency and conservation. We have not done very well at changing our fuel mix, but we have done quite well at reducing our energy use, and there's a lot more that we could do.
In our house, if you leave a light on, you have to pay 25 cents if you're not natural.
That's a good idea.
Many thanks. And we want to have Jim to sign a few books. So I'll welcome all of you out there at the book table. And I want to thank you for coming tonight. At the risk of shameless self-promotion, I'll say that April 25, just about a month from tonight, will be the next Friday night at Cary. Many of you probably know it. I'm going to retire from the Cary Institute this year, so I actually opted to give the lecture on Friday night, April 25, the Ned Ames Honorary Lecture. You can be there and hear my view on environment as the swan song. But the important thing is to thank Dan Fagin, who came here tonight, and